why is there so much suffering in the world? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And why can't we seem to come to a place, whether you're a believer or not, where you can understand that humans have an inherent value? Well, if you're not a believer, then you are completely out of luck. There's not going to be an abstract, observable, repeatable way to value human beings beyond, something that is purely, ultimately subjective and just based on, your level of connection and understanding of other human beings. However, God places a value on us, and it starts and stops and ends with the simple phrase, let us create man in our image, which of course in and of itself is fascinating. And of course that's with Genesis, which was the subject of my last couple of videos that got really long, and I hope you were able to sort of watch those and ingest those and ingest them again and maybe revisit them. And I talked a lot about the value of human free will, right and wrong, and of course suffering and why we suffer and what is God's ultimate plan for that and how that factors in to the answer of why is there so much suffering. The Bible verse, and the only Bible verse I'm going to sort of cover today, is Hebrews 2:5-8. And let me just sort of get there, because it's really interesting. Here we go. Hebrews 2:5-8, very short. It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking, but there is a place where someone has testified. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them. And that's such a almost cryptic alliteration to, specifically, it's a cryptic alliteration to the coming of the Messiah who would redeem mankind. And that's an entire separate discussion video, in of itself. It would require God to transform himself into this humanity, into a being, in order to sacrifice himself and redeem himself. But that's what is very interesting, is part where it the sort of person who's writing it pontificates. What is mankind that you are mindful of them, that a son of man that you care for them? You made them a little lower than the angels. And it starts out 5. It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come. Now, subjected means subjugated. So, we human beings in our flesh and our temporal existence and our birth and life and death and our limited understanding and basically our own focus and access only to the physical plane, we are lower than the angels, yet crowned in glory. We are made in God's image in a very specific way. And it's very interesting because, you talk about cryptic, made in God's image. There's no specific explanation for what that means. We just seem to sort of assume that, like when you look at a mirror, you're looking at yourself as an individual, yet somehow on a spiritual level, the reflection also shows back some aspect of the Creator, of God. It's very difficult to pin down specifically what that means, other than as a Christian you have to accept it. And therein lies the foundational value for humanity. And speaking on how you value humanity, what I sort of said in the beginning, humanity is put in charge of creation. We're given dominion and a place above creation, and a sense of glory that is above that of the angels, although technically we are beneath the angels in capability because we're flesh and blood. You know, we bleed, we die, we have very limited understanding. We only have access to creation, this physical realm. So we're beneath the angels in capability and understanding, yet have this special place. We're, I'm going to say this phrase, we're God's favorites. It's practically, if you want to just simplify it down into one phrase, we're God's favorites. And because we're God's favorites and the way we have been placed in the pantheon of creation and the spiritual realm, that has garnered us an enemy. Okay, so when you talk about why is there suffering, that's one very, very, very big part of it. Our placement in creation and the fact that if you understand and you read Isaiah, which that'll be another video, the enemy wanted, in simple terms, wanted the throne, but what was the enemy trying to actually gain? A level of glory and understanding that wasn't his, a level of ascension that didn't exist. The angels have their own specific place and apparently aren't made in God's image. The angels are just very different created beings. And what the enemy wanted was something that was very different from what the enemy was. And the conflict between this enemy that I'm talking about and the creator is sort of focused on that in the simplest terms. And I know this sounds wild, you know, yet it makes perfect sense because we have troubles with jealousy here on earth. You know, we have troubles with jealousy in our lives. We get very, very, very insecure, jealous, and feel inadequate in all sorts of situations. And I don't even have to begin to sort of illuminate to you what those various situations are, because some of them, you know, money, success, appeal, personal standing, just being glorified, you know, jealousy is a big problem. And when you have free will and the ability to make specific choices based on what you can and can't do and how you accept how you accept the presence and existence of certain facts, things get dicey right there. I spoke in the last video in Genesis that there was a very, very, very special link in creation between God and man, and the real issue with the downfall of man, the fall of man, and why it introduced evil into the world is there are certain aspects to suffering that are directly connected to free will, in so much that we become jealous. You know, it's almost as if the enemy wants us to suffer the same fate that he did if he makes us feel inadequate in the same way that he is. There's you know, the purpose of what he said to Adam and Eve was to create a division. And when God is talking about, you know, her heel will crush the skull of the snake, something to that effect. I want you to go back and read it. I'm not going to read it for you. There's specific language that God says to Eve. And this is another one of those things where I've always sort of taken a little bit of an issue with how women are sort of crapped on. And it's used, you know, the fall of, you know, Eve's failure, which is just part of the failure of humanity and human nature, is brought up first. But it was through a woman's, and I think God uses the word woman's seed, and women don't have seed, but that would crush the head of the serpent. He knew at that moment that he would, through humanity, devise a Messiah, a creation of himself, a variation of himself that also, for a temporary time, would be all omniscient, yet physically, in the physical plane, a little lower than the angels. And there's a sort of a clue in there. Being in the physical plane apparently means you are disconnected from the spirit realm, and by default a little lower than the angels. I'm sort of asking the question instead of making the emphatic statement. God had to put on flesh. God had to put on flesh himself, of himself, and remove himself outside of the eternity, put himself into time, which is one of the reasons why he can apparently speak to himself and pray to himself, because that's how different eternal realm, eternity in the spirit realm is from creation, which is physical and exists within a finite beginning, middle, and end reality. God had to do all that in order to redeem us. And the beauty of it is that we get a phenomenal insight into his love for us, which includes free will, which includes the ability to do what we actually did. And it doesn't sound all that preposterous when you factor in the aspect that people want to become parents, or at least aunts, uncles, or something. They want to recreate out of love themselves a new being. They want to have a child. I'm just trying to be all fancy about it, but that's good. People want to become parents, knowing that it's incredibly risky, and knowing that there's going to be more than one moment where that kid that they have, boy, girl, is going to try their nerves. Don't touch the stove, don't stay out too late, come home right after school, do your home, the whole nine, for every stage of existence. And that's coming, and there's going to be days where going to put hands on that kid, but people become parents anyway. God knew that the specific physical creation that he was bringing into existence in the physical reality, humanity, mankind, he exalted them and gave them glory, but completely understood that with a lack of knowledge combined with free will could be a powder keg. Just like every parent, it's not like you're going to expect your kid to be perfect, and that. You also know, whenever you give your kid a cell phone with the understanding that if you're lost, call me, or if you need help with your homework, contact me, or if you need money, I'll give it to you. All that stuff. All those are examples of you having a preconceived plan for possible failure. I remember one time as a kid, my grandfather had given me a BB gun, and long story short, my dad came home from work one day, and I used the BB gun to shoot a hole in one of the windows, and so I had to replace the window. And what really blew my mind, and because this is 1983, 84, so I'm 10, 11, I'm a kid, is how calm he reacted to it. He was like, oh, okay. He just and he got glass and he fixed the window, and he wasn't even angry. He just fixed the window. That is an example of the love of God. Have an understanding that specific ages, specific levels of development, some you're ready for and some you're not, and you will make mistakes. Doesn't mean I don't love you. Also, that, as silly as this sounds, does give us a lot of insight into the whole tree of life, and why these things were offered to them. Obviously, the plan was at some point in your development, I'm going to give you this level. What I'm talking about, and I'll just say it in plain English again. There are wealthy people who buy their teenagers really expensive sports cars. At one point in time, if I remember correctly, in the early to mid 80s, if you went to the right prep school, 15, 16, and 17-year-old teenagers were being gifted Mercedes-Benz and Porsches as their first cars. What am I getting at? You wouldn't gift an 8, 9, 10-year-old a car, whether it was a Porsche or a Chevy or a Ford or whatever. Okay? There is a plan for your child to develop to a point, and the wealthiest parents have more money to spend on their kids, right or wrong or whatever. That's something that happens. Even to this day, they exalt their children because they love them. The pre-understood, preordained plan to redeem man is kind of like that. I have a place for you. I have gifts for you. And when the time comes, at the certain level of development, you're going to get this knowledge. But I've got to make it available because you have an understanding of it. Just like a 10-year-old can be aware that their parents are wealthy and know that oh, at some point I'm a trust fund kid. At some point, this inheritance is mine. And when I'm 16, I'm going to get a car, and it might even be a really nice, expensive one. I can either wait or I can't wait. You get the analogy that I'm sort of putting together 15 minutes into this. A great deal of our suffering is just our free will and our inability to have a perspective that is from the kingdom, that is a perspective that is born out of a being that is actually made in God's image. And so the enemy comes along as an accuser, and as he did, it's called the accuser in other parts of the Bible. I will let you find them and look them up, because it's very clear. We've all heard the thing, especially if you've been a Christian for a while. Satan calls you by your sin, but Christ calls you by your name. And that's what an accuser does. In fact, in the book of Job, that whole misadventure where Job has to lose everything, physically and almost mentally, it started out with an accusation. The accusation isn't necessarily about Job specifically, but Satan shows up. Where have you been? Oh, I've been going to and fro, seeing who I can devour. But the accusation is they only love you because of what you give them. So he's accusing man of being shallow and only loving their creator God because of the blessings. And he's accusing God of not understanding the value of the love of the created beings that he has exalted. Because again, Satan wasn't created in God's image, apparently. It was created, all the angels and these other beings, whatever you want to call them, these other spiritual beings, have a different essence to them other than just being spiritual beings. They're not necessarily in the image of God. They have a different essence to them, and they're not exalted in the same way we are as God's children. And it's hard for us to understand the specifics of that, other than, sort of random clues we get mostly in the Old Testament about that. But the accuser comes in and exploits weaknesses in our knowledge that exist in a lot of ways because of free will and our lack of understanding of the connection we actually share with God, which is why he did what he did, so that we could be redeemed. So it's an interesting loop that you see play out. And I don't think the Bible is written simplistically, because it's not very simple. First of all, you've got to really delve into it and read mass amounts of it and see the big picture. There's allusions to, Hebrews, Genesis, other stuff. The sons of God looked down on men and saw that women were fair, and they went down, and all of those sorts of things. There's a lot going on in these ancient stories, and that's what I talked about when I talked about Genesis. And they're all very complex clues that really delve into who we are and why we're here in a way that science just can't. I mean, there isn't even, go into that. I will probably do a video at some point that gets a little bit more into the weeds on the secular view of the origins of the universe and humanity, and specifically why. Because I think there's a very real reason why there's no concrete evidence one way or the other, and sort of we've just been operating under different theories at some point, because there's people who are blinded to that. And it makes sense in a way. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance that has to happen when you stop and realize that there is a creator God who is infinite, omniscient, all-powerful, but created you for a specific purpose, both as an individual and as humanity as a whole, and as a plan, but gave you enough ability to make your own choices concerning what you'll do and the value of those plans, but lives outside of time, outside of our temporal zone, and sort of has an understanding of what you're going to do before you do it, because then we get back into the whole debates about determinism and things of that nature. But for now, as I end this, understand what really comes down to is that you are loved, both as an individual and as a collective member of humanity, because you were created in the image of a God that loves you. And that reality is a huge factor in the reality of why there is so much suffering in the world. There's something else out there that is extremely upset and jealous about the fact that although we were made a little lower than the angels, we were exalted above them. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but I hope it's the starting point for you for something phenomenal.